All right, I think I will go ahead and kick us off. Thank you so much to everyone who is on the call with us today. This is Safeguarding the Minnesota River, Legal Solutions to Agricultural Pollution. And my name is Currie Griffith. I am the Water Program Director at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And I am joined here today by two of our excellent panelists. And rather than give you a pre-written description of their bio, I'd like to ask both of them to tell us a little bit about their professional background and their interest in this issue. So Leigh, let's start with you.
Thanks, Currie. Hi, everyone. Leigh Currie. I'm the Chief Legal Officer here at MCEA. And I graduated law school in 2005 and have been working in environmental law since then. But before that, I also studied biology and conservation biology. So I have a science background and a legal background. And so this kind of problem where you're bringing the science together with potential legal solutions is really exciting to me and one of the reasons I love working for MCEA.
And Patrick.
And I'm Patrick Belmont. I'm a professor of hydrology and geomorphology. That's water and dirt at Utah State University in the Department of Watershed Sciences. I was department head of Watershed Sciences the last 4 years. I have degrees in biology, ecology, geology, and then I was in civil engineering at University of Minnesota for 2.5 years. And that's when I started this work. And then I continued working in Minnesota for about the first 10 years that I was out here in Utah. So really glad to be here.
Wonderful. I'm excited to be part of this conversation with both of you today. So what I will do is I will moderate today's conversation. But before I jump into questions for our panelists, I want to give an overview of why we're here today. And our goals for our hour with you, the next hour, are twofold. First, we want to help people better understand how altered hydrology in general and agricultural drainage specifically has impacted the health of the Minnesota River over the past several decades. And secondly, we are here to shine a light on some of the legal strategies that we think could help restore our state's namesake river. So a little bit of historical context. The Minnesota River has often been cited as one of the most polluted rivers in the state and in the nation. Many of you with us today may remember in 1992 when Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson announced a plan to clean up the river to the point where it could become swimmable and fishable again by the early 2000s. Instead, in 1997, American Rivers listed the Minnesota as one of the 10 most threatened rivers in the United States. And 10 years later, it remained on that list. Today, we see continued excessive sediment and nutrient loads that remain a serious problem in our state's namesake river. So MCEA has a long history of work on this issue. We have long partnered with other groups that are based in the Minnesota River Basin to protect that landscape. We have, for example, undertaken successful legal challenges for individual drainage projects in places like Big Stone and Rendell counties. And more broadly, when we look at water quality issues across the basin, we can see that the state has made notable progress on permitted sources of pollution like wastewater treatment plants, but that agricultural drainage systems and their continued expansion remains a big challenge that drives many persistent water quality impairments. And just as a sidebar here, when a water body is impaired, and we might use that word throughout the hour today, that means that it's too polluted to sustain a particular use, such as aquatic habitat or recreation. So that is why MCEA and its partner organizations have identified cumulative impacts from agricultural drainage as an environmental issue that needs to be taken on in Minnesota. And we have started to strategize policy and legal solutions that we could use to turn this entrenched problem around. So as you will hear today, the Minnesota basin is particularly vulnerable to impacts from agricultural drainage, but the solutions that we will discuss can be used in agricultural regions across the state. So now I would like to turn to our panelists. I will ask Dr. Belmont to help us better understand the Minnesota River Valley, its vulnerabilities, and the role that agricultural drainage has played in water quality issues there. Then we'll turn to Leigh to talk about the strategies that MCEA is pursuing to mitigate this source of pollution and chart a path towards cleaner water for all. So I will begin with you, Dr. Belmont. Can you please paint a picture for us of the Minnesota River Basin? What part of the state does it cover? What is the geology and the primary land use? All of the things that your degrees in geology, ecology, biology, etc., can help you describe.
Sure. I brought a few slides just to help talk through that. When I started working in Minnesota, I wasn't that excited about it. I had just finished my PhD working in Western Washington State in the Olympic Peninsula, huge mountains. And then I thought I'm going to go do a postdoc in a corn and bean field in Minnesota. And it didn't sound that exciting. And it turns out it's a fascinating landscape to work in. It was greatly underappreciated when we started working there. So here's where the Minnesota River is. For any of you that aren't familiar with it, kind of cuts through the southern third of the state, makes a big check mark here. And all the land that drains to the Minnesota River is about maybe 75 miles or so on either side of that main stem river there. And so all that land is part of the Minnesota River Basin. And one of the things that got me excited to study in this really otherwise very flat landscape is the geologic history. And I'll just give it to you really briefly here, but glaciers have come down various times throughout geologic history, and they just smeared sediment across this landscape like butter. And so this whole landscape of northern, central, and southern Minnesota have this glacial sediment and multiple layers of it from the different glaciers coming down and then retreating and coming back down again and retreating again. And so it's this glacial sediment that's a lot firmer than soil. It'll hold a cliff, but it's not as hard as rock. And so, that kind of set the template for the landscape here. And then about 13,000 years, a really exciting thing happened geologically. There's a huge glacial lake that you can see here that covered a lot of Manitoba and Ontario, and that catastrophically drained through the Minnesota River. Now, this was receiving all the meltwater as the ice sheet was retreating. And this is what really fundamentally changed the way the Minnesota River works compared to a lot of other rivers in the world. And so if we look at the landscape, this is the topographic map of the landscape today. You can see, the main stem Minnesota River here. The river valley is in blue. And that's where this huge torrent of water kind of downcut the whole river valley. This is a photo I took of that spillway as I was taking off from MSP Airport once. So you can kind of imagine this huge spillway. That's almost 250 feet that this big glacial outwash event downcut the entire river valley. And what that did was for all the tributaries, these rivers that flow into the Minnesota River, it dropped, the river they flow into by 250 feet. And so you can see all these tributaries here. This is the Le Sueur River down near Mankato. It has been downcutting to get down to that new Minnesota River. And so, what really surprised me, one of the first things that I found as I was starting to work here is these have been some of the fastest downcutting rivers in the world. And that was shocking to me because you wouldn't expect that in a very flat landscape like this. But that's what we were finding. And that's what told me that there's actually a much more interesting story here than just, a lot of agriculture, too much sediment. There's something more going on here. So that's a basic sense for the landscape.
Great, thank you. So I love the image from the plane too, to really show what it looks like on the landscape today. So I'll shift to another question here. We have agricultural drainage in the title of our webinar today. I mentioned it a few times in my introduction. Can you describe what exactly agricultural drainage is and why it's so widely used?
Yeah, so, for thousands of years, most of these flatter areas were just tall grass prairie and wetland. That's what was covering this entire landscape. And as people wanted to start farming it, it was very poorly drained and it was very hard to grow a crop there. And so even as early as like the mid 1800s, farmers started, implementing drainage strategies to start getting water off the landscape. And so, what that looks like today is, this. They're putting these corrugated pipes that have holes in them, and it just drains the landscape, tries to remove water from the landscape as quickly as possible. And it's been remarkable what a profound change that farmers have been able to make to the entire Midwestern US. In this image here, this is a satellite image. It was taken after a rain event. And so you can see where the soils have already dried out. And each of these lines here is an individual tile line. And so you can see the density that these are going in. You can see the big reams of them that are kind of rolled around and put in very efficiently into the ground now. This is a huge industry. We've got millions and millions of miles of this drainage tile in the ground now. And the only way that we know where it is by looking at satellite photos like this. This has all been done without permits and things like that. So, it's been up to the individual farmer to figure out how to drain their landscape most efficiently. And what I'll say is they've done a great job. They have drained the landscape incredibly efficiently. But we're going to talk about how there are some unintended consequences of that as well. But the benefits are clear. It's increased crop yields. They usually pay for these systems within 2 to 3 years. So it's doing exactly the job that we've asked it to do, drain the landscape as quickly as possible.
Great. I think that gives a good sense of the benefits and the reason why this practice is so widely used in Minnesota and really across the upper Midwest. So let's pivot to some of those unintended but significant consequences that you mentioned. So how does this practice impact our waters, and in particular in the Minnesota River Basin and its tributaries, that vulnerable landscape? And one additional question I'll ask you to cover in your response is, how do we distinguish between the impacts of agricultural drainage and increased precipitation in general?
Yeah, great question. So, I'll show a graph here because a lot of the really intensive drainage has gone in when we made the transition from soybean or from small grains and hay to soybeans. So this is looking at two different small watersheds, part of the Minnesota River Basin, the Redwood River Basin here and the Whetstone River Basin here. And you can see the crop types, over the last couple of decades. And we've seen this transition at different times from mostly corn and small grains to exclusively corn and soybeans, basically. And that happened in the Redwood in about 1976 is where that transition really occurred. In the Whetstone, it occurred much later. It wasn't until 1991 that they really started replacing those crops. But what we see in the two plots below the land cover transition is the rainfall in blue and then the river flow in black. And just qualitatively, when we look at this, you don't see a big change in the amount of precipitation. The precipitation has gone up a little bit, but it doesn't really even show up at this scale in either of these watersheds. But what you do see is there's a lot more black. So the same amount of precipitation, essentially, but a lot more runoff. And that's occurring right after this, change in land cover, which means that the change in drainage. In the Whetstone, again, that land use transition occurred much later. And so the change in runoff occurred much later there. And so we're able to track pretty closely, that change in land cover and the intensification of the drainage with the changes in the hydrology that we're seeing. And there are a few basins that really haven't had much drainage at all. And we see a very modest increase relative to what you'd expect with increases in precipitation. So we're able to track this spatially based on what we're seeing.
Well, I think that's a great description of hydrological change in these tributaries within the Minnesota River Basin and how that ties to this change in land use. I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about nutrient and sediment pollution, which is what we think of when we think of impaired waters in the basin. So, and we know that this kind of pollution can damage aquatic habitat and our ability to swim or fish in many of these waters. So how does the widespread practice of agricultural drainage tie to nutrient and sediment pollution? And because I know this is an area of expertise for you, how do we know where the sediment comes from in particular and how that has changed over time?
Yeah, great questions. I'll talk a little bit more about the hydrology here, but as it relates to all those things you just asked about. So we're not just seeing changes in the total volume of runoff. We're seeing changes in lots of different parts of the runoff. And so this graph here is showing for 12 different places we've been monitoring the Minnesota River and its tributaries, how peak flows, the very highest flows, have increased in the last couple of decades. Those are the green lines there. How the low flows have changed. Those are the blue lines there. They've all gone up. And so different parts of the flow regime have different implications for the amount of erosion, for nutrient cycling, for fish habitat, things like that. And so, one of the things that we're seeing is with the increase in high flows, we get a lot more erosion near the channels. And so I've just got a video, hopefully that's playing for you guys through Zoom. You can imagine if we're putting more water in the river channel, it's going to raise the flow levels, and the river's just got that much more power to erode its banks. And it's easy to look at this and say, well, it looks like a nice, peaceful river. I've been caught, my canoe capsized when I was down doing field work in this area, actually, and got pressed up against a tree. And, water is just so powerful. And you don't know how powerful it is till you've been pushed up against a tree by it. And I narrowly got out, but it was very dangerous. But you increase flows just a little bit, and it just makes it so much more powerful to erode the banks and bluffs and things like that. And so that's what we've been seeing. It's just amplification of the erosion. So that's kind of the qualitative sense for it. Maybe I'll go into a little bit more of the quantitative way that we've done that, because we've done a tremendous amount of work to actually show how that has impacted things. So a little bit of a nerdy graph here, but just stay with me for about 2 minutes and we'll get through this. We can do modeling of sediment, but sediment's a really hard thing to model. We're talking about enormous areas. And so if you're off a little bit in your model over an enormous area, you can be off by a lot, right? And so we have to have ways that we can go out into the field and measure lots of different things and make sure that we're really understanding the story, and that all these different lines of evidence that we're creating are lining up and we're getting the right answers for the right reasons. So we went and built a sediment budget and we measured erosion in lots of different ways. And just to very briefly explain how that happened, if we look over the last 13,000 years, that's a time period in geology that we call the Holocene. We've got sediment sources coming in from the top of this sediment budget. We've got sediment sinks. Those are the floodplains coming out the bottom. And then the efflux, this is sediment that's going out to the Minnesota River this is the LeSueur River. And I've looked at that within the Nick zone, these really rapidly downcutting regions that I talked about. And, that's about 50,000 tons per year coming out of erosion of the bluffs and the banks along the channel. We've got little gullies and ravines that have created another 11,000 tons or so per year. When you go above those nick points, those really rapidly downcutting areas, we don't know exactly how much sediment's been coming from those, but we know the numbers are small because we don't have big holes in the ground, basically. If you get, even a little bit of erosion over long periods of time like this, you get big holes in the ground. This is very simple geology. So we just know these are all small numbers up here. And so this is the sediment budget for kind of the natural background for what the Lasur River has been doing over the last 13,000 years. I want to contrast that with, this time period that we have really good monitoring for, 2000 to 2010. And now all of a sudden, just from the bluffs, we've got 107,000 tons per year being eroded. From stream banks, we've got another 24,000 tons. This is all the uplands within the kind of incising area. It's 23,000 tons per year from all the agricultural land, basically. All the rest of the agricultural land is another 45,000 tons. So you look at 95% of the landscape are these upland agricultural fields, and they're contributing about 70,000 tons per year. It's not negligible, but it's not where most of the sediment's coming from at this point. And so I think that's really important to understand. Farmers actually have done some good things reducing soil erosion, and they've gotten these upland agricultural erosional, soil erosion processes down. But by putting in all of this drainage and getting the water off the landscape as quickly as they can, increasing the power of the river, they've really exacerbated erosion of all these near channel sources. And that was a story that really shocked a lot of people when we first published it back in 2011.
Well, I'm sure everyone on the webinar can now do a detailed read of any sediment budget that they come across. Thank you very much. I know that project took a lot of your time and work and a lot of relationships that you built around this project in Minnesota. So I want to ask you one more question, Patrick, before I shift to Leigh. And I want to go back to where we started, which is, why is this so widely used? And you gave us a good explanation and the fact that it's been very good at what it was designed to do. So, we recognize the importance of crop production as an economic engine and a source of livelihood across the state of Minnesota. So I'm interested to explore with you how we balance that with these impacts that you've discussed. And why, if we know of some good solutions, and if you can shed light on if we do, why haven't those been adopted at a scale that would help to mitigate the problem so far?
Great questions. So, these are used because they are profoundly increasing crop yields. Nobody disputes that. They're doing exactly what they're designed to do. But we can't ignore the unintended consequences. We're all paying the price of the unintended consequences of all this increased power that the rivers now have in an already very geologically fragile landscape. And so, there's lots of different things that we have explored that we could do. We could be doing more conservation tillage. We could be managing the drain tiles differently. We could be managing the ditches differently. We could be restoring wetlands. We could be putting in detention basins, kind of more utilitarian type wetlands. We could be putting in buffer strips, and we have put in a lot of buffer strips. We can talk a bit more about that. Increasing soil organic matter, putting in cover crops, doing bank stabilization. This is what a lot of people, especially a lot of farmers, wanted to see as a solution. Let's just fix all the banks. But rivers don't work very well that way. It turns out once you do this in one place, they just blow out banks elsewhere. And so you end up, really with a no-win game there. So there are a lot of different things we can be doing. They all cost money. They will all cut into profitability and productivity in some of the farmland. What we found to be the most effective and cost-effective and environmentally friendly solution was putting water storage back into the landscape. If we're going to leave the drain tiles in there, we at least need to be holding the water back temporarily so that we reduce those peak flows in the river and reduce some of the highest flows are doing the most damage right now. The other benefit of that is that it actually will remove some of the nutrients as well, and some of the other problems that you mentioned. It helps with those as well. So I can talk more about that in questions, but I want to make sure Leigh has time to talk.
Thank you so much for the expertise that you've brought to this conversation, Dr. Belmont. And yes, we will. I see that we've already started to collect some good questions, so we will reserve time for questions at the end of our conversation here. So please keep those questions coming in the Q&A box. So Leigh, I'd like to shift to you and ask you some questions about how opportunities that MCEA sees on this issue. So on the surface, I think most people would agree that it's a problem that our waters, our lakes, our rivers, our streams have been negatively impacted by such a widespread practice in our state. So why has this problem been allowed to go on for so long, and what role do you think the state has to step in and help protect our waters?
Yeah, so I'll start, by saying that we tend to think in Minnesota that we have, great water. We're proud of it. We're the land of 10,000 lakes. We love to swim, fish, recreate. But a lot of people don't realize just quite how extensive the impairments and the polluted areas are. And we also tend to think we have pretty good water pollution laws in Minnesota. And we do have some, good protections in place, but that hasn't always been the case. So we have a state law that covers agricultural drainage. It's called the Drainage Code. It dates back to 1887. And at that point in time, wetlands were not viewed as providing any value whatsoever. They were vilified, really, for harboring mosquitoes and other insects that led to disease. So at that point, draining these seemingly useless areas of land to create valuable farmland was encouraged and incentivized. And the drainage code that was set up was not about how do we balance environmental harms with crop benefits. It was really a structure that allowed for assessments and an allocation of costs among landowners that were benefiting from a particular drainage project. And that fundamental framework is still what the Drainage Code does. And I'll just go on a slight tangent here that, the root of the pollution problem that is caused by agricultural drainage it's really common among so many environmental problems today. A lot of what MCEA works on, that common root is the failure to account for environmental costs as part of our economic systems. So it's not just drainage, that the costs of cleaning pollution or avoiding pollution are paid for by society, by us, our healthcare bills, and through taxes, that fix broken infrastructure, through insurance for increasingly common floods and wildfires. And that's how the Drainage Code is set up. The cost of draining agricultural land is seen as, simply what it costs someone to hire an engineer to design a system and what it costs to actually install that system. It doesn't include the cost of the eroding banks, that Dr. Belmont was just talking about. It doesn't include the threats to homes that are along the riverbank, the cost to dredging Lake Pepin on a continual basis to make it usable. Costs to drill new wells for drinking water, or systems to allow you to drink your water, like reverse osmosis. So ignoring these other costs, if you will, really tips the scale in favor of continuing to install these systems at the detriment to our health and environment. So I think fundamentally, to your first part of the question, I think that's why this has gone on so long. Is this sort of skewed system of valuation where we ignore these external environmental costs. In terms of the role that the state plays now, we've learned a lot since the days where we were incentivizing the draining of swamps. And now we have laws that, limit the discharge of pollutants into our waters, that limit the draining of wetlands. We have a goal in the state of Minnesota that no net loss of wetlands. We have laws that limit the ability to change the course, cross-section, or current of a public water. And these protections are administered by different state agencies. So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is in charge of water pollution. the Board of Water and Soil Resources administers the Wetlands Conservation Act. The Department of Natural Resources protects public waters. But none of these recent laws and none of these agencies have interpreted their authority as being applicable to agricultural drainage.
Thank you, Leigh. So I think that's a good sense of how we got here, why it's gone on for so long, what the historical perspective was that led to the development of the laws that have been on the books for a century or more. How does that compare to how drainage is currently regulated? You talked about what we've learned over time and how some of our systems have changed. Has there been the same change in how drainage is regulated?
Yeah, so like I said, we still use the drainage code, and the framework, the fundamental framework has not changed much. A brief description of how it works: there's a government unit in charge of administering the drainage code. It's called a drainage authority. A drainage authority is essentially either a county or a watershed district. So if a landowner wants to drain her land via a public drainage system, or improve a public drainage system so that the more water comes off her land, she can petition the drainage authority to establish this public drainage system or improve the system. And the drainage code does include criteria that must be considered. And these criteria do include things like water, water quality, sediment, erosion. But there's no real test or threshold for, how we should weigh these criteria. The code just says that the drainage authority must consider them. And then once they're considered, the drainage authority can dismiss the petition for this improvement if it determines that the environmental harms outweigh the public benefit. But there's really no information about what that means or how that balancing test should occur. And in our experience at MCEA, we've never seen that clause invoked. So if it's, if it's used by drainage authorities, it's used fairly rarely, I would say. And just, I think the piece that's really missing, and you might have said this at the top, from the current regulatory structure is a way to consider the cumulative impacts of all the drainage systems, either, throughout a particular watershed or in a particular geographic area. The way the drainage code is written right now, we really just look at, each project by project in an isolated way. And we need to figure out how to account for these cumulative impacts.
Got it. Thank you. And that was a helpful discussion about the county ditch authorities, because we did have a question about that come up in the Q&A chat. So thank you for that. Okay, so how do we combine the legal and policy expertise that we have at MCEA with the scientific expertise that people like Dr. Belmont bring to the conversation? Where do we go from here? What are some of MCEA's recommendations, and are there other examples of attempts to address this problem through legal tools?
Yeah, great questions. So, MCEA has spent a lot of time. We're a 51-year-old organization. We have spent probably all of those 51 years trying to protect Minnesota's water. And that includes tackling the really difficult and thorny problem of water pollution from agriculture. So we at MCEA, we're coming at agricultural water pollution from many different angles, which needs to happen. Drainage is just one part of what's happening right now, but it's a really important part of the puzzle. We will not be able to meet the state water quality goals or nutrient reduction goals without addressing this, this drainage elephant in the room. So, I'll highlight that this week we published a report that discusses the impacts that agricultural drainage has on water quality. There will be a link to the report in the chat. Dr. Belmont is one of our co-authors. We have another academic, Brenda DeZiel, who also co-authored this report. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a lot more information in there than what we can cover in this hour. But at the end of this report, after we talk a lot about sort of the impacts and the causes of the water pollution that we're trying to solve today, we have 4 policy recommendations that we think at MCEA would make some headway toward minimizing pollution harm from agricultural drainage. So our first recommendation is to support efforts and to research and understand better the economic harms from drainage. So I already talked a little bit about this, this sort of fundamental flaw in how we value the environment vis-a-vis, commodities or tangible goods. But we have studied these societal costs in other ways, in other cases. Like we've looked at what the social cost of carbon is in the realm of climate change. Academics have looked at the social cost of nitrogen pollution. So it's been done in some contexts, but we haven't attempted to really study sort of those cumulative societal costs of agricultural drainage. So that's one recommendation, is support efforts to do that, so that we can have more information about what costs we're really talking about here. Second, we recommend more consistent environmental review of drainage projects. So there is a very small minority of projects that might undergo what's called an environmental assessment worksheet. This is a document that looks at all the environmental impacts of a project, but an environmental assessment worksheet is only required for a drainage project if there's a public water involved, which is a subset of all the water in Minnesota. And even then, only if certain other criteria are also met. So it ends up being a very small subset that end up actually getting this more holistic environmental review. So we think a more consistent approach would be better. So this could be done through the Environmental Quality Board, where they set up a category where drainage projects would automatically undergo some type of environmental review. There's another kind of environmental review that we think could be helpful. It's called a generic environmental impact statement. This is a report and analysis that looks at the impacts from a certain sort of class or category of activity rather than from a specific project. So this could be helpful in an area like drainage where we don't really have that robust analysis of current environmental damages. The third recommendation in the report is to consider market-based strategies, like a cap and trade system is one example of a market strategy. So this is a kind of system where certain types of pollutants are capped at a particular level, either for the whole environment or maybe for a specific geographic area. And we already do this for water bodies, some water bodies that are impaired through something called a total maximum daily load, or a TMDL. This is a measurement of how much of a certain pollutant a water body can accept without exceeding a water quality standard. So we already do this for several impaired water bodies. But then once you establish that cap or that maximum load, entities that generate that pollutant can be allocated a share of that total allowed amount. And then if someone can't affordably meet their cap or their share, they can trade with another who is able to more economically reduce their discharges. So consideration of something like that was our third policy recommendation. And then lastly, we suggest regulation of public drainage systems by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So as I talked about earlier, the Pollution Control Agency is the body with jurisdiction over water pollution in the state of Minnesota. There's no question that drainage systems are leading to water pollution. So it just makes sense, it makes intuitive sense that the Pollution Control Agency would have a role in managing the proliferation of drainage systems. So we suggest that the MPCA should use its authority to require water pollution permits for drainage systems, just like it does for all sorts of other pollution sources. And then, you asked if there are other examples of legal tools to address the pollution from drainage, and there really aren't. most water pollution is controlled like at a national federal level by the Clean Water Act. But there are exemptions written into the Clean Water Act for agricultural stormwater runoff and irrigation runoff. So whether it's rain or whether you're watering your fields, if it runs off your field, the Clean Water Act says you don't need a permit for that. These exemptions have been interpreted as including the discharges that come, from a drainage pipe or a drainage ditch. But I will say that exact question of whether a drainage system actually fits within this agricultural exemption has not been fully adjudicated. There was a case in Iowa, Des Moines Water Works was the plaintiff, where this question was raised, but that case ended up being dismissed on standing grounds. So the court never got to resolve that specific question. And then there is a case in California that asks the question with respect to irrigation runoff, since they rely so much on irrigation in California, that was collected and discharged through a drainage pipe, and whether that met this exemption or should have a permit. That case has been in litigation for 14 years, and there still isn't a final answer. So right now, I will say there's no other good model for like a permitting program or a legal approach to managing drainage.
Thank you, Leigh, and that was especially helpful I know we have attorneys on the webinar with us today for CLE credits, so that was a very useful background for that audience in particular. So what I heard from you, Leigh, is that there were 4 main policy recommendations in the MCEA report that came out yesterday. The first was around economic tools to assess downstream or watershed damages and incorporate them into the costs. The second was the environmental review tools that we're proud to have here in Minnesota and ways that we can improve them to address this particular challenge. The third was cap and trade programs, especially if we develop nitrate aquatic life standard for streams and rivers. And then finally, this permit approach. And I'm intrigued, as a last question for you here, Leigh, if you can just say a little bit more about how this permit example might work on the ground, and if we have examples from other types of similar permits in the state.
Yeah, so the MPCA, the Pollution Control Agency, issues water pollution permits for all sorts of entities to allow for what would otherwise be illegal discharges. So the permits allow MPCA to put some limits on like the amount of this pollutant that you can discharge, or require mitigation measures, or require best practices or other ways to protect Minnesota's water resources. The permits issued under our State Water Pollution Control Act, so separate from ones that are issued under the Clean Water Act, are called State Disposal System permits, or you might hear SDS permit. These permits are used for discharges that don't necessarily require a Clean Water Act permit. So maybe it's because they discharge to groundwater instead of surface water, because the pollution comes from what's called a non-point source rather than a point source. SDS permits cover that, but they can also be used for traditional, point source pollution to a river. And we think using this kind of permitting system to regulate drainage systems would be a great solution because it wouldn't require additional legislation. So the statutory definition of a disposal system that requires a permit includes anything that's designed to dispose of a waste product, and a waste product is anything that might pollute water. So, drainage systems are designed to dispose of agricultural wastewater or excess water, and that water tends to pollute the receiving water. So we already have a statutory authority that says this is the kind of pollution that really requires a permit. And then, we've thought about ways that this kind of permit system could be relatively easy to administer or sort of minimize the administrative burden, I guess, while still being effective at controlling pollution. So one mechanism is the use of a general permit. So general permits, like a general environmental impact statement, like we talked about, general permits cover a type of activity rather than a specific discharger. So, there's less kind of project by project administrative burden. So someone seeking coverage under a general permit would submit information to the PCA to determine if they are eligible for coverage or not. And this information submission could be the same information that the person was already required to submit to the drainage authority. And there's one type of general permit that we think could be particularly analogous, which is the municipal stormwater permits. It's really a similar kind of water pollution, and the MPCA already has a permitting system for that municipal stormwater. And so with that kind of permit, there's a design manual that includes kind of a menu of best practices that the permittee can choose from in order to get coverage under that permit. So maybe for their situation, a stormwater retention pond makes the most sense. But for another person, it's a different best practice. And we think that same kind of system could really work well for drainage projects and use some of those practices that Dr. Belmont was pointing out. And then, there's other ways to simplify it. It could be a pilot program. It could be limited in geographic scope. And I guess lastly, I'll mention that a lot of the sort of science and analysis that you would want to underpin a program like this is already being done and could inform any sort of permitting system. So we already have what's called One Watershed, One Plan. This is a program in Minnesota where the Board of Water and Soil Resources oversees the development of a comprehensive management plan for every watershed. So we have that. We also have what's called a watershed restoration and protection strategy for many of the watersheds. That's under the purview of the Pollution Control Agency. So these plans and reports could inform any sort of general permit that might be developed. So that's a little bit more about that idea.
That is a lot more about that idea. Thank you, Leigh. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I'm going to move to closing remarks for both of our panelists because we have over 25 questions collected in the chat and more coming in, so please keep them coming. But before we turn to questions, I like to ask, I always like to end these conversations with closing remarks for both of our panelists. So in particular, I'm interested in particular for you, Leigh, sort of what comes next and how we advance this work. And then in general, for you, especially Dr. Belmont, is there anything else about this issue that you think is important for people here today on the call with us to understand or to leave with? So I think I'll start with you, Leigh, and then give Dr. Belmont the last word.
Yeah, so in terms of what comes next, there's a lot already underway. One thing that's happening in real time is a draft update to the state nutrient reduction strategy. So there's an opportunity right now to submit comments on the draft that was just released. So, we can put a link in the chat that helps you navigate to commenting on that. But that's one action you can take right now to say, as part of your strategy to reduce nutrients, you need to also address agricultural drainage. And the report recognizes that we won't be able to reduce nutrients effectively without tackling in agricultural drainage, but we want to, hammer that point home. So that's one big step. And then always, there's always legislative changes, like changing how the costs and benefits are weighed in the drainage code. MPCA could initiate a permit program on its own. Probably not likely to do so without a directive, but those are kind of the next things we're thinking about.
Thank you. And Dr. Belmont, any last words for our listeners today to leave with or aspects of this issue we haven't explicitly covered?
Yeah, I think just to remember that there are some really big costs associated with allowing all this drainage to continue in the way that it has, not just in the sediment nutrients, but the flood that caused the Rapidan Dam to fail was much, much larger because of all the artificial drainage. That was a huge cost Minnesotans are going to be paying. So many roads being undermined, things like that. These are big costs. And this is all linked to some much bigger issues in our economy and society. And I think maybe if I can just zoom us out back to that level, you know, our economy that we have built is so incredibly capable of doing amazing things, big, incredible things. But it's also very capable of creating a lot of damage. And so we have to be all the more aware of the unintended consequences. And we have all the tools that we need, and we've talked about several of those tools here to solve those unintended consequence problems. But we really have to get to solving them. A lot of people are looking at Americans right now and just saying, "Oh, we're too politically divided to do anything," and that can't be the answer. And I believe below the political divisions, there's something deeper happening in terms of just our relationships with each other. You know, we are relationally frayed as a people, and we're not talking, we're not communicating in ways that are allowing us to solve these problems. And I really feel like that's got to be at the heart of moving forward, is restoring some of these relationships with a commitment to integrity and honesty. And there's no doubt that we can solve these problems. These are all problems with readily available solutions. So it's been amazing to work in Minnesota. All the times that I've been doing field work there, I've never been denied land access. Minnesotans have such an incredible, you know, conservation ethic, environmental ethic. It's a really special thing. And so, as a little bit of an outsider now from Minnesota, I'd just say lean into that and come together as people and let's get this solved.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much for your time and your expertise. There was really a wealth of information covered today in terms of both the science behind the vulnerability of this landscape and the impacts from agricultural drainage in particular, and some of the creative work around policy solutions that are highlighted in the report that was released yesterday. So I do definitely encourage people to take a look at that report if you're interested to delve into this further after today's discussion. And with that, I would like to transition to a few questions before we end our time together. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, and I think this one is for you, Dr. Belmont. So we had a question about specifically, how does one hold the water on the land? What are some ways to do that? And then I'm going to tie that to another question that had to do with the water storage program that we have here in Minnesota. We did get appropriation from the state legislature for this program. What are some of the opportunities that we have because of that program, and some of the potential continued work to do?
Yeah, great questions. We have done a lot of work on this, and so I'll just try to summarize it very briefly. There are many, many things that we can do that help a little bit, but the one really big thing we can do is just storing more water in the landscape. Now, what does that look like? That looks like going back and possibly restoring some of the wetlands that were there before, where water would be coming out of these drain tiles, but it's going to a wetland where you get sediment and nutrients removed. Or it could be just building some detention basins, similar to what we do in urban stormwater runoff situations, where we're just using existing depressions or building a few berms here and there, but dedicating part of the land to storing water so that we slow the runoff to the river and reduce those peaks. What we showed is that just using existing depressions in the landscape to store water, we can reduce sediment loading by 40% if we take 4% of the landscape out of production and use it for water storage. If you start building berms, you can probably get down to 2% of the landscape to get a 40% reduction in sediment. That's a big deal. And I was there in 2008. I knocked on a lot of doors to get the constitutional amendment passed that created the Clean Water Amendment. And I was thrilled to see Minnesotans raise their own taxes for environmental purposes in the middle of a financial disaster. That speaks so highly of Minnesotans, and I talk about this all over the world. Um, but we're not making, there's a lot of good things that have come from that, don't get me wrong, but we're not making the best use of those funds. There are not nearly enough projects that have been put in the ground. And I'd love to see ways where we're making that process more efficient and more desirable for farmers to take advantage of it. I don't have all the answers for how to do that, but I know that it can be done. We can be doing a lot more projects less expensively.
So it sounds like ways, recognition that this is going to take some big investments to move the needle on, and where we already have money to set aside to use it efficiently at a watershed scale, and then also continue to look for other opportunities.
Right.
So I have another one here that I think I'm going to kick to both of you. The lack of any meaningful state oversight of local drainage authorities, and this is again what Leigh discussed. Usually Board of Commissioners or watershed districts act as local drainage authorities. So the lack of any meaningful state oversight of local drainage authorities is one of the most significant gaps in water management. But interest groups hold deeply conflicting positions. Where can broader support for reform come from, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, great question. There are a lot of deeply entrenched positions, whenever you talk about an ongoing pollution problem like this. I think ways to build sort of more general support are around some of these potential solutions. So I think I hope that, as we move forward and try to push some of these recommendations forward, that we can get, a groundswell of support, recognizing that, we need a statewide solution, and this is, a way to advocate for that.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, a lot of the work that we did involved a large stakeholder group that included farmers, it included corn and soybean lobbyists, as well as folks from the MCEA and DNR and elsewhere. And this gets to this relationally frayed point that I was trying to make before. We are not talking as a people. We really have isolated ourselves, and that's not going to work. Minnesotans they do really have a strong environmental ethic. And so getting people together to have the hard conversations that we need to have with a commitment to honesty, I think that's got to be a key part of the path forward.
Thank you both. I'm going to end with one more question. I think it really picks up on themes that we've discussed throughout the hour. But just to sort of tie a bow on it, how might we advance policy, environmental policy in Minnesota while the federal government pulls back from environmental protection? Leigh, you talked about the exemptions in the Clean Water Act that mean there really isn't a federal tool to regulate drainage in a different way currently. So what are some of the opportunities at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, I think I already kind of walked through, and I would point this question asker to check out the last chapter or last part of our report, because I think, there's a lot more information in there than I even covered in that explanation. I will say, in terms of, how do we make progress with the current federal administration pulling back, we really need to lean into these state solutions, especially in a state like Minnesota, where, as Dr. Belmont was pointing out, we have a strong environmental ethic. We had 75% of people voted for to renew the constitutional amendment, or it's not as divided in Minnesota as it is in some other places. So states like Minnesota need to lean into our role right now in protecting what we have, our resources that we have here in Minnesota, our namesake river, and do it if we can't rely on the federal government at this point.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly to that there are a lot of things being broken at the federal level right now. And I think it's helped me to take some pause and think about ways things have not been working well as they were. And as things break, how can or should we be rebuilding them to be working in not such narrow ways, but in much broader ways to achieve the outcomes that we want?
Thank you both so much. I also really want to thank all of our viewers today for the really excellent questions that you submitted. You know, we got over 30 questions, and I'm really grateful for that engagement and close listening. This was a dense webinar, so thank you. And just as a final reminder, you know, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is a nonprofit organization, and your support makes webinars like today and reports like the one we've put in the chat possible. So please consider a gift if you want to help in the work to advance these solutions at the state level at this time of federal uncertainty. So with that, I will release you all back into your day. Thank you so much for your time and for your interest in Minnesota's waters.
Thanks all.